Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can we please have a round of applause for our guests? So here today to talk about her book, The Black Side of the River, is Jessie Gleaser, that's how I say it correctly, and Troy Crestwood, one of the interviewees from the book. It is about language and communication and identity and Black identities, if I'm not mistaken. A very, very interesting book, and I'm gonna let them take it away. Here you go.
Fantastic. My name is Jessie Gleaser. I'm a associate professor of English linguistics at the University of Tennessee. And we're here tonight talking about the Black Side of the River, both the book and the place. And my colleague, Troy Crestwood, Crestwood Media Group, right, is the
Crestwood Group.
Crestwood Group.
Yeah.
Is an interviewee in the book, although we were just discussing the fact that I don't remember after I pseudonymed all of my interviewees who he is. He's one of two people. and was part of the project several years ago. So Troy, thank you for being in conversation this evening.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on the launch of this book. And I'm excited for you, and I'm excited for the audience that will get a chance to, at some point, read it if you haven't already. And I think tonight's conversation should be interesting and wide-ranging on east of the river, but also I would say we should talk about DC, because you don't have east of the river, you don't have Ward 8, you don't have an Anacostia without first having a Washington, DC, and all that means too.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what does it mean to you to be a representative of the east of the river, to be part of the east of the river community?
Yeah, so I should back up and say that, is this thing on? I don't know what's happening. I feel like it's getting lower and lower. I think, so I moved to Anacostia back in 2007, August in fact. It's coming up on 15 years. I purchased a home here, and this was at the time I was looking to, I had just graduated from grad school, and I was looking to go, honestly, I was gonna follow the normal migration pattern, which is to go out to Prince George's County. That's where all Black folks went, right? They got a little money, or a little something, they all moved out to the county. Now that migration pattern is going south toward Charles County as well, if you're all familiar with that. And some folks are going off into Montgomery, and some people are going into Virginia, but the vast majority of, at least my family, went into Prince George's County. So I struggled with it. I was like, well, of course I'm gonna basically do the same thing, but I'm a person of faith, and so you might hear me talk about God a lot. But I got a sense early on that I was needed here, that I wasn't so much needed in Prince George's County, but that there was a purpose for me right here in my hometown, specifically in Anacostia, in Ward 8, which is where we are. And so I came, I moved, I got engaged, I met people, I met my neighbors, I met others who were running for office. They encouraged me to run for office, so I ran for advisory neighborhood commissioner and won. First time out. Oh, thank you. Because I was like, who's going to do something about these issues here? And the word I heard was, you don't complain, do something. So I ran and became a commissioner, really got my butt, beat, I should say, in terms of the community. He said, okay, so now you're our leader. Well, here are our needs. One, we need this, we need that. I was like, okay, all right, this is very different. But again, I grew into that role and eventually became the chairman of our commission. Matter of fact, the commission that's right here, that supported Busboys when I was on the commission. And now I'm the president of the Ward 8 Democrats. So we're gearing up for, a big election season here in the district. So I say all that to just give you a little bit of background that I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian. My family on my mom's side, they have gradually migrated from the western side of Washington, D.C. to where I am now, which is here on the eastern side, and even further east out into the counties. And so for me, I just had that calling that I needed to stay here. And that's what I did. I stayed locally and got engaged and got involved, and I'm still engaged and still involved.
Yeah, I think that's the pattern, right? That like, so sometimes I've described it. In fact, I think we wound up cutting this from the book because reviewers were like, "That's really confusing if you can't actually see it." But people can see it. They can see me doing this now. But like, I talk about Black migration through the city as being like a fan. Like, think of an old school hand fan. And like, it was opening in the west and moving like sort of clockwise down and sweeping into southeast. And one of the really fascinating things that I talk about at the conclusion of the book is this sense that people have. I had multiple people call it the last bastion of the chocolate city. And people said, you know, this is the bastion of Black people in DC, and like this is going to be the stronghold, the last place that's holding out, right? Because you know we talk about DC as chocolate city, of course, which comes from 1970s when easy to remember 1970s is when it was 70% Black. And that was the city. And in the course of
Going downhill.
It's been going downhill, right? And in the course of me working on this book, that was I was collecting data on two sides, interviewing people on two sides of the actual split, which was probably around 2015, 2016 or so, that DC became plurality Black instead of majority Black. And so it's been an interesting shift, an interesting 10 years.
It has, and you know, as someone who grew up here, who, especially during the time when not only was the city majority Black, I mean, you couldn't go anywhere in the city and really see a lot of white folks.
Mm-hmm.
The only place you really saw them, not even on Capitol Hill, by the way, really where you really saw white folks was mainly in the West. West of the park.
West of the park, and east of the river.
Yep. Right. Everything for the most part, I'm generalizing here. I know I'm the academics here, so, you know. But most of everything.
Only a couple.
From the, east of Rock Creek, all the way to where we are here east of the river, was a stronghold of Blackness. And I say that not to, you know, come across as someone who don't believe that other people shouldn't be there, right? But growing up as a kid, that's all I saw. I did live, so I should tell you, I've lived all over Washington, D.C. We grew up a lot, we moved around a lot. My family was impacted by addiction. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, we moved a hell of a lot. But the interesting part of that was I got to really know the city in a way that most people who I know who are from here don't know it. I knew the bus routes. I knew all of the different transportation routes in the city that folks who grew up here, like generationally, they don't know because they never really had to traverse the city the way I did. I say all that to say that east of Rock Creek Park, that you had, you know, Black wealth, and you also had Black poverty, and then you had pockets of both in very many places as well. And then you had the majority, which was primarily east of the river, where it was concentrated. You know, it was very different for, I think, people to understand what we went through. And as a result of, as you know, poverty, that begets a lot of challenges, mm-hmm. some of which we still experience today. And so Washington, D.C. was a very interesting place. And you use the terminology of a fan, and that's a great way, I think, of visualizing it. Oh, you know, like I guess that a Chinese fan,
right?
It opens like that.
Yep.
I use the terminology of wave in terms of how we just, the wave after wave, it doesn't, it's not the one wave that takes you out, right? It's the wave action over time that eventually will move you. And so that's what we saw, at least for my family, the gradual marching eastward. And, but again, at that time, Washington, D.C. was a fascinating place, and it still is, but in my young eyes, I just saw Black people in positions that were so unique to Washington, D.C., that when I would see cousins and friends from other places, they were like, really? Y'all have a Black mayor? You have a majority city council that's Black? You have Black people making money? Like, actually, yeah, we do. And so it's no accident that you've seen the Bob Johnsons and the Sheila Johnsons and many of the Black bourgeoisie sort of come out of Washington because there was this incredible sense of community that was here. And even in the 80s and the 90s, it was still here, despite some of the challenges that we had and currently have today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that to me was one of the biggest things that came out of the interviews that I did. So in the book is I think 34 interviews, and I have still several more that I conducted that I didn't deal with, and the theme of Black affluence keeps coming out, right? This idea that in DC you have Howard, you have this.
I'm sorry, I have to do HU. That's what I have to do.
I don't feel licensed.
I'm so sorry. Okay, so did you go in some capacity, or are you connected at all?
No,
you just know the chant. Okay. She didn't want to leave me hanging.
I was like,
appreciate that.
I'm also completely out of the loop. But yeah, you have Howard here bringing in all of this history of Black, like, intelligentsia was the word that was actually used by one of my interviewees in the book. And he was like, yeah, he lived in North Carolina, and he said, I was told by my high school teacher that you have to go to DC because the streets are paved with gold, and you have to go to Howard, and you have to meet the intelligentsia of the Black community, and like that framing of what DC is, I think, is particular to DC. This idea that DC is a place of Black wealth, it's a place of Black prosperity, and even in times when it hasn't been, or in places where it hasn't been, like that's the narrative, and that allows a certain kind of claim staking of all right, you might knock on Anacostia for being lower income than the rest of DC, but that's not how you talk about it on this side of the river. We talk about it as being a place of wealth, a place of Black richness,
Right.
And that's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In my work, we certainly, at least I don't try to sugarcoat the realities that we're facing. Poverty has been concentrated east of the river.
For sure.
And it was done by design and by plan. I'm not saying it was sinister, right? A lot of people get into that piece of it. Oh, there was the man, and he. Honestly, the land was cheaper here.
Mm-hmm.
It was mostly undeveloped, and so if you have a crisis, a housing crisis, and you need to build housing to get people off the streets and out of what we had at one point shanty towns over in Southwest, the alley. I think you talk about that in your book, yes?
Yeah.
The alley dwellings that we have. There's some wonderful photography out there of showing beautiful Black people in these alleys, right? This is well before there was, well, the wharf was there, but not the wharf as you know it today.
It was an actual wharf.
It was actually a wharf. Yeah, exactly.
Much less IPA.
Yeah. But, because of urban renewal and of course because of the freeway system, they basically bulldozed that whole area. And so, yeah, you had to provide housing for people. I mean, the media, for better or worse, was covering, well, what are you guys doing? You taking these people's homes and here they are kind of homeless. So the government, feds, they look for the cheapest land, right? Because they want to do things as the federal government typically likes to do. I'm lying here. On the most economical scale possible. And so, they built a lot of public housing here, and this is where it was concentrated. And so as a result of that, you did have a downturn in terms of how people looked at themselves, how people, I guess the expectation of the people who lived here. And when I say how they looked at themselves, I mean that they knew that, they were being housed in public housing. And, but they were also being looked after in a sense as well, right? So there's that. I still feel you're right, though. For the most part, when you talk to people who grew up here, and a term that I learned that I didn't know, that folks who live in what we are now Ward 8, they call themselves Ward 8-tonians. And those are people who are prideful about being from east of the river. Now, keep in mind, this whole ward thing is about maybe 50 years old, maybe a little less than that. Since Home Rule, when the District of Columbia received Home Rule, they broke it out politically into these wards. We didn't have that. We just had east of the river, west of the park, uptown, downtown, over there, as I just said. But my point is that we didn't really have wards, and the establishment of the political system with the limited home rule that we had gave people a sense of pride. They now know they are from somewhere, and they're from a number, not just a neighborhood where you're like, where's that? You can say I'm in Ward 8, and I know exactly where I'm at, and you know where that is if you're familiar. And so it did give people a sense of pride to be from here. And I must say, again, the ward has some incredible resources, some incredible vistas. I think I heard you talk about that. And incredible people. But many of them have struggled and are suffering from trauma, generational trauma. Despite all of that, people here generally have an optimistic view of themselves in a city that's rapidly changing.
Yeah.
If you talk to them, they would say, well, the city is no longer my city, right? That's new DC. You've heard terms like that.
Yep.
And I speak of it like I'm removed from it, but I think I'm very much part of this community here. But I just want to give a sense of what you'll find when you talk with people is that Washington feels very much familiar, but also distant to people who grew up here. The Ward 8-tonians, I guess the Ward 7-tonians, people who grew up here. I lived all over the city, so the place I call home is Ward 5, or called home was Ward 5 near McKinney Tech, and what I now know to be the Eckington community. I never knew what that was or when I was a kid, but now I know it's now Eckington, and that's where we grew up. In fact, my family, on my mom's side, who I mentioned earlier, the Gradual March, they were the second Black family in the 2100 block of 2nd Street Northeast in the foothills near McKinney Tech. And then, as they moved in, others moved in, and white people moved out. The area was all segregated because McKinney Tech was segregated. The only Black high school at the time was Dunbar in Armstrong. And so, it's just interesting to see how now we're here in Anacostia. And it is largely the last bastion. And I wouldn't just say Anacostia, I would say east of the river.
East of the river, yeah.
Because there's some wonderful neighborhoods just besides Anacostia is about that big, actually, on a map. Really that big. We have communities like Bellevue and Congress Heights and Washington Highlands and Douglas And I know I'm missing some. Should be terrorists. And then of course you have Marshall Heights, and you have Fort DuPont and Fort Davis. Oh, you have Hillcrest. I'm sorry, Hillcrest people. And Bain Heights and Deanwood and all those wonderful communities that Black people have struggled in, but they've also tried to build a life in as well. And so it really is, yes, we talk about Anacostia and Ward 8, but you really got to look at the entire landscape when you think about Black people and what's left in terms of how they see themselves and how they see their placement in the city.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things about it being small, that was a piece that was that lots of folks emphasized, right? So first of all, you know, you have a section of one interview where one of my older interviewees, Gus, and he was like, no, Anacostia is like, you have to understand that Anacostia is real small. He's like, it's like people say Anacostia and they mean the entire east of the river, but like actual Anacostia is very small and intimate. He lays out the land on the map and thinking about the historic part of the neighborhood versus the surrounds and where people are from. And that sense of smallness, I think, is also about it's about the close-knittedness of the community and trying to explain the ANC system to people who are not from DC. And I'm like, yeah, I was like, you have a city council person who's for your block, like pretty much. Like it's actually right.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
That's pretty good though. All the men, a lot of people who we talk about this, they think about Chicago, and they have a huge city council, right? So yeah, I think that's actually a very great way. Although some commissioners may say they are the mayor.
Yep.
So there's that.
Which is very apropos that we're sitting in the Mayor Marion Barry room.
The beautiful Marion S. Barry room. He was the former mayor, obviously, 4 terms in total, but then he was also the council member for Ward 8 until his death. And so he's beloved, and I think, and of course there's no secret that Marion Barry had a drug issue and some other issues as well. The public wasn't too kind to him. Nationally, let me be very clear. The national public wasn't too kind to Marion Barry, at the height of his challenges. But those who were from DC, again, back in 1990, you had still 60%,
Right.
Black population, still chocolate city. First of all, many Black people had family and relatives going through this as well. I certainly did.
Right.
And so, and it wasn't pretty. I think at the time people thought, oh, you're supposed to keep it hidden. Look, folks, it was not pretty. It wasn't pretty then, it's not pretty now. And so at the time, Blacks, no matter what your economic levels were, you certainly knew what addiction was and how it was impacting your family. So they were very forgiving to him. And 4 years later, he was mayor again. He said he cleaned his life up and he's ready to get back to fighting for the people. And the folks believed him. And they voted him back in with large margins, over 50%.
Yeah, and I think I sometimes wonder what role being from Ward 8 played in that. Where he really was representing this, no matter what you think, and I get into in the book some of the, we call them in linguistics, the big discourses around an area. And of course, there's some discourses about east of the river. When I give a talk about this, there's a joke map of DC that was put out where they label each neighborhood with a silly name, like Georgetown is Metroless Pop Collar Polo Land. And
sounds about right.
Yep. Woodley Park is Single Ladies and Pandas. But the entire east side of the river is zone of perceived danger. And yet, this is where the title of the book came from. It is perceived of as being the blackest part of DC, and so you are an authentic chocolate city person coming from here, and I don't dig too much into Marionberry, but I've always wondered, felt like that had something to do with it. You know, representing Ward 8, you're representing DC in a particular way, and I think that's important.
I think you're right. To know Washington, D.C., to know the Black experience here from home rule through now, you have to know Marionberry.
Yeah.
Because Marionberry, he was part of SNCC, came to Washington to organize people, around voting, and lo and behold, we wouldn't let him go. My grandmother loved Marionberry, and she was a young lady at the time, when they both were young, I suspect, and my grandmother, Eva Henry Marshall, she shared a birthday with Marionberry. So if you can imagine, every March the 6th, it was like, yes, it's my birthday, but you know who else's birthday it is? And I'm like, yes, Grandma, Marionberry. My grandmother, by the way, raised me. And so, my God, if it wasn't for her, I would not be the man I am today. And by the way, my story isn't unique. There's a lot of Black people around my age, and maybe even younger, I'm sure younger as well, whose grandparents had to step in, largely grandmothers who had to step in during times of crisis in the family. And so that's the other thing too, the resilience that is part of the culture here. And that, of course, comes from being resilient from slavery and through Jim Crow and through not having the right to vote and all of that until we got the limited home rule that we currently enjoy.
Yeah.
But just to put a button on it, yes, to know Ward 8, to know Washington, D.C., you have to know Marionberry in his life. Because keep in mind, a lot of people, I know you talk about this in the book, they migrated from the South.
Right.
In a way, Barry migrated from the South and didn't leave, right? He saw an opportunity here to work for people, and he did. He really did change the way people saw their government in Washington, D.C. And I always say, if you want to look to the success of Marionberry, look at Prince George's County. That was really that was the area that in my view, and even you can just bear this out, when Black people started having access to local DC government jobs, again, right? You start making different decisions for your family. You say, well, I would like a fence and so a little yard or a little peace and quiet, a tree in the front yard, place that's safer for my family. And so many people begin to move out into the county. It is now the wealthiest Black county in America, still is. And so, this began honestly with Marionberry getting Black people who for the longest time was shut out of local government here in Washington, D.C., an opportunity to work, not just government workers, but also contractors, an opportunity to, create wealth for themselves and to move up. I mean, that's the American dream, is to move up. And you had a lot of Black folks who, there's some resentment, don't get me wrong, you had cousins who got left behind and aunties and brothers and stuff, but what it did was it showed for the first time what's possible. So when you talk about that people do have a largely positive self view of themselves or their surroundings despite their struggles, it is because they have seen the examples of what is possible for them, even if it may seem out of reach.
Yeah, I absolutely think that. I think a really interesting problem that's happening now, of course, is that we have a lot of folks who've moved out, or sometimes they're second generation of folks who've moved out. So at one point, Tana is one of my interviewees, and she was talking about how when she grew up, the refrain was, we're moving to Maryland, we're moving to Maryland, we're moving to Maryland, right? And it was all about all these people hopping right over the line, going over into PG County. But then the problem becomes, well, how do you get back in, right? Now that something that was $250,000 is 1.2 million, and how people move back in, which poses a really interesting new problem for DC more generally and Southeast specifically.
Yeah. Yeah, and this isn't unusual in cities around the country.
Right.
You know, the cost of living is a lot higher in cities today than it was. It's the reverse, right, than what it was back then. Yes.
And I'm not gonna lie, I don't mind what has happened to my house in Knoxville. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of people in that position, right, who feel that they, I mean, listen, in this country, the way you build wealth is by and large through your home. And so if you don't have a home, A, you're at a disadvantage.
Right.
But then B, if you decide to move out, which is great, listen, most of my family is in Prince George's County and Charles County. I have folks in Virginia as well. But however, I think if they wanted to move into DC and get something quote unquote affordable, they would have an extremely difficult time. So much so that I had mentioned to council members, I said, you know, I love the fact that we have invested in low income residents who are looking for a home ownership opportunity. That's great. You know, I wish more would take advantage of it. I wish I had taken advantage of it when I was a lot younger. But there is also the squeeze on those of us who are in the middle. And let's say we want to stay here, but we want to move to a larger home. I'm talking about myself. It's difficult for me to do because I don't have the resources, A, and most of the resources that are set aside for home ownership tend to go to those who are low income or considered to be low income. And again, I have no qualms with that. But what I am saying is that there's also those of us in the middle, maybe even lower middle, and could use some help as well. So I've mentioned that to several council members who will listen, and I'm saying it again. So yeah. Can I talk a little bit about accent or dialogue? What is dialect?
Yeah, absolutely.
I know this might be a book, of course, right? So as you can hear, I'm someone who speaks very clearly and very conscious of how I speak. Well, you know, I think part of it is because I've moved around a lot, A. But then B, I am still that same guy, right? You give me, if this was not tea and something else, you know, you'll begin to hear more of my local, you know, regional sort of accent here. And, you know, early on, my goal was to become Jim Vance. If you've been here for at least 10 years, I know, don't leave miss Jim. I got to intern with him, and Jim was just awesome. I miss him as well. But my goal was to become Jim Vance. Like, that's all I wanted to do. And so, I was going into broadcasting, and I had people who like to listen, the way you talk, you know, that's not going to get you on air. And so I literally working with wasn't a coach, it was more of a diction teacher, helped me to minimize that part of me so that I could go into a Cincinnati or a Knoxville or, you know, one of these small markets and work my way back to my hometown. But when I go to those small markets, my accent would be relatively neutral, and that would then, you know, afford me an opportunity to work there. Well,
So you think.
well, and that was the going thought back then, right? You know, but there was a news director at NBC4, right here in DC, NBC Washington, I think they call themselves now. And Bob Long, he's passed on. He was such a cool, interesting guy, white guy. And I said, well, this is what they're saying to me, Bob. And Bob said, well, I've been listening to you, and I think you're fine. I mean, yeah, you have a little country and a little southern type of, twang, but that's okay. Like, we're moving toward an era now where the audience expects some authenticity, that you bring some flavor to their airwaves, that you bring yourself, all of yourself, to the airwaves and not this vanilla version. And this was like 2003. Now, we have certainly arrived now, but back then he was such a visionary. He was like, this is where we're going. He said, I would not stress out about it as much as I was at the time. Fast forward, I'm comfortable in every space, right? In the neighborhood, on the block, at the White House, and I've certainly been in these places. I think I'm comfortable because I feel like, and it's not even that I'm consciously changing how I speak. It's subconscious, A. But B, I still feel like it's my authentic self. I just want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying. If I'm in a neighborhood, if I'm in a community that, requires more accessible language, then that is exactly what I would do. If I'm in a situation, boardrooms, working with certain clients that I have from time to time, I try to impress them perhaps, but also it's my language too. Like, it's all of me. That's all of me. All of that encompasses me. From the African American vernacular all the way up to the Queen's English. And so I think you'll find that dichotomy, or you'll find that code switching, if you will, very much in circles like mine and in other professional circles, because it's just a necessity that we feel we have to do. But again, think about Bob Long. Bob told me 20 years ago, we're moving to a more authentic type of society. And at some point, people will just be whoever they are and would get those spots on television or get those spots wherever. And I certainly think he was right about that, because today, I'm fine with you speaking the way you speak. I will, if I don't understand you, I will ask you, well, what do you mean by that? Well, go into detail, explain it to me. And I think that's where we are now. But for the longest time, it was always looked at as a negative. If you, quote unquote, spoke broken English, or if you, quote unquote, didn't quite close your vowels, or you had a different sound, like I know New Yorkers, right? New Yorkers and like Boston and all of that. Like, if you had a different vowel sound than what it actually should be, like, that was considered a negative. Now I consider it to be a plus.
Yeah.
I very much want to hear how you authentically talk and how you authentically sound, and we'll be good together.
Let me grab you on some DC dialects.
Oh.
So like, do you know words like seist
Yes.
and luncheon?
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Explain those.
So size is someone who is really excited.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So put in a sentence, you say? Yeah. So I am sized right now to be in conversation with Jesse, right, about this book and about this topic. Like, I'm real sized. I could also be sized because I just got a new pair of shoes or a nice gift, or I'm about to go on vacation. I'm sized. Yeah.
Excellent.
Excited.
How about luncheon?
So
Once you go on vacation.
Right. So the interesting thing about luncheon is that, so let me just define it first. So luncheon is someone who is like crazy. They're not quite in their right mind. But when you look deeper at that word, you know how people used to say, "Oh, something wrong with him. He must be out to lunch," or something like that. And so I think there's some type of a grabbing of that and incorporating that into luncheon, and luncheon with the M on the end.
Yeah. I think it's very. I had one person who thought maybe it was launching, like you're launching off into the moon. I was like, I don't think that's it. I think it's out to lunch, but I thought that was a really interesting take. DC DC and linguistically is really interesting, and so it's funny because as you were talking about, so this project started. The nature of academic research is such that you start doing one thing and then you discover like, oh, that's not actually what I should be looking at, and so on and so forth. And so by trade, I'm a sociophonetician. Big word, unpacking socio and sounds. And so interested in the connection of like social meaning to like individual little things. And I originally started working on East of the River because I thought, I read an article about Black gentrification that was happening. And thinking about these changes of Black middle class and Black upper class, you are far from the only person to tell me about diction classes and diction coaching and things like that, which has led to, spoiler alert, which is actually not in the book, and coming out later on this year, some really interesting things about how people do pronounce their endings. And probably coming from this kind of like, you have to enunciate, you have to be careful, and then this sort of hyper careful speech becomes part of being a middle class Black person, is to sound a different way.
Or sounding white.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
although, I mean, it's interesting because I don't know, I think people think of it as sounding white, but I would be interested to know how many Black people who think they're sounding white sound white, if that makes sense. And like, we still have particular
Gotcha.
Black ways of being and Black ways of inhabiting, right? I'm getting a high sign from Dr. Nicole Holiday, who's in the back. She studies Black intonation.
Oh, okay.
And, and so.
Oh.
I have thoughts.
She has
Sure.
many thoughts, right?
That's a great point. I think it is, so we can just talk race in a real way. I think there's a white supremacist view
For sure.
that even Black people have about what is whiteness, right? And what is Blackness. And so I think I've never heard a white person come up to me and say, "You sound white." Now, I have heard a white person call me articulate.
Yes.
I don't take offense to it because I am articulate, but I do think some will take offense to that. And there have been mixed company where I've corrected even, say, well, actually, yeah, you expect them to be articulate because they are this, they are that. With that being said, though, I think that that it is, I've always heard from other Black people who say you sound white. And I think, again, that's because they have been brainwashed, or they have bought into the white supremacy narrative that to sound a certain way, to enunciate, is akin to being white.
Right.
And what I have tried to do, and I know I suspect what you have tried to do in your research, and what many others, including the professor in the back there, is to illustrate that it's not about trying to be white. It is, you are Black. And there's very few people who, like you said, who actually sound to a, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe to a white person you might sound Black or white. But I think the point is we have to instill in our young people, we still gotta do it today, especially young Black people, that it's not about sounding white, it is simply about intelligence, it's not intelligence, but it is about ensuring that you are heard and understood.
Right. I mean,
That's really what it is at its core.
And there's some room to interrogate, I think, because I think, when you're thinking about what it means to sound authentic in public media, right? What it means to be a broadcaster with a particular voice. And I love listening to NPR these days because you just really hear a bunch of different voices. You hear somebody like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget the name of the host on the morning show, but it's like, yeah, no, that is a Black woman that is there, and I can really. She doesn't use syntax, grammar features of African American English, but she's got the intonational pattern, she's got the cadence, and there was a time when she wouldn't have been able to go on on NPR sounding like that. Audie Cornish does not sound like that. Audie Cornish comes from a different generation where she was taught to sound a particular way on NPR, and she sounds really different than the younger hosts, or Stacey Vanek Smith from NPR also, right? She's got this very young woman style, it's a young white woman style. But she's got this very young woman style, and some people find that grating because they're just like, oh no, you shouldn't sound like a young white woman, even if you're a young white woman on NPR. How dare you be young and woman and be on the radio? And so I hope that we're getting to a point where we, where we're able to push back against some of those white supremacist narratives. There's a rhetorician, Asao Inoue, and Brett Comp, and he talks about white supremacy culture, which I think is a really nice way of thinking about it. It's kind of like we're the primordial soup that we're swimming in, where we say, okay, this is the more important thing, this is the thing we should be going toward. And we're like, well, I acknowledge that that's there, I acknowledge that that's the soup we're in, and how do we gently push back on that with the way that we sound, and the way that people talk, and so.
And a lot of it is regional, like where you grow up, where you live. Like again, I sound the way that I sound because of where I grew up and the people who spoke language to me at a young age, you know. And so if you, I don't want to out my cousin here, but like, she grew up in Houston, and
hey, we got some
East Town. Okay, I love Houston, my second home. And like, she's always accused of being a white woman, even though she's Black. Now for her, she grew up in, a part of town where there were very few African Americans other than her and her family. And they went to schools that were also largely white. So this was her environment. This was, she sounds the way she is supposed to sound because she got her vocal cues from, the people around her, including her education. And so she's a product of her environment. She also moved around a lot too. But, that also helps. When you move around a lot, you pick up different things. Like people always ask me, and I'm from here, but they ask me, where are you from? Right? It's like you're from around here. I'm like, yeah, I'm from here, fourth generation. But so I don't think it's unusual.
You did say marrying Barry instead of marrying Birdie, and so that.
Yeah, that's a giveaway. But the thing is, again, if I had something just a little more potent, you would have heard Barry, or as we say, Murray. It's more of a. But again, I know that as an entrepreneur, as a person who does media work on air, as a person who helps you with messaging, all of that matters in terms of how I need to present myself. So you would likely not want to hire me if I was slurring my speech, right? But if you hear that I am articulate and speak well and have good vocabulary, then they'll say, oh, okay. And by the way, that's universal. I don't think that was just for white folks who may want to hire. I think that's even Black folks too. They're like, wait a minute, because Black folks are just as picky.
Well, one of the really interesting things that I found in my work is that people have a sense of, when you're talking about code switching, right? And so there's a real sense of like, oh, you have an audience, you have a particular place, I need to sound this way with these people, and in this other place I can sound this way. When I've had something potent, I can sound this way, and so on. And one of the things that I found is that even within the kinds of things that people are talking about, people will shift one direction or another. And so if you're talking about DC, you're gonna sound a little Blacker than you would if you're talking about Ward. If you're talking about Ward 8, you're gonna sound a little Blacker than you would if you're talking about school or other kinds of things. And so that was a really interesting finding as well. And so I think it's important to acknowledge like these these power systems and the kinds of effects they have on people's language. And I also hope that some Murray and Burry people, that we start to recognize like, oh yeah, that's a way of being. I mean, I got into my work in part, I was adopted by a white family in Cincinnati, grew up with white parents, and then they have a biological son who's my oldest brother, and then they adopted my middle brother, who unfortunately passed away last year. But he's also mixed, and we sound completely different. And there was a really interesting intersection, I think, of gender, where what it meant for him to be a male with melanin meant that he sounded different, meant that he needed to have a slightly different way of being than, like I sometimes say, when I put on African American language, and he could never put off African American language. And so we just had these really different relationships to the way that we sounded, and I always thought that was fascinating, and so.
That's pretty interesting. Certainly I know people who put the language on, but it's not authentic, right?
Right.
It's for show.
I have to be real careful.
It's for show, it's for effect.
Yeah.
And again, I just say be yourself. I had if I could say, I have another cousin, won't name his name, but he grew up, I shouldn't say the county because then people would know, but he grew up nearby, and he had, access to the best school, his, family, educated, well, relatively wealthy, middle-class people, but just was drawn to the streets, and to the street culture, and all that means. And so, everything from slurring the words and, trying to be, trying to maybe overcompensate or try to be innocent. I mean, to be fair, he was someone who was trying to figure himself out, as most young people do. But I think for him, it was more so looking back, he was putting it on. He was trying to show I'm down. I'm this, I'm that. When the truth is, be yourself.
Right.
And if people who don't want to engage with you are like, nah, you sound like this, like that, you move on to someone else. But that's easier said in hindsight.
Right.
Back then, I mean, if you really wanted to be in a certain clique or a certain, group of people, then, you had to fit in.
Yeah.
And all that means.
And there's a certain type of Black masculine socialization, I think, that aligns with that kind of street rough culture kind of thing that changes the way that I think sometimes not just the repertoire, like it changes the linguistic repertoire that many young Black men are allowed to inhabit. One interview that I conducted, it's not in the book at all, but I interviewed 4 18, 19-year-olds up at the Fort Stanton Community Center. And we just had a fantastic conversation, and it was really interesting listening to them weave their way through what it meant to be users of Black language, what it meant to be Black residents of Ward 8 at 18, 19 years old, trying to figure out where they're going next, whether or not they're going to college, whether or not they're going to work, and the different ways that happened, because this is, I sort of hit the nail on the head, right? It does boil down to this identity issue, and that's why it's called race, language, and belonging, and it's all about who you belong to. So
that belonging part is very powerful.
Yeah. So Sesame, I know you flashed me a sign. I don't know.
Yeah, 10 minutes left. You're still good.
Cool.
5 more minutes.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if we want to take some questions from the room. If the room has some questions. We've stunned them into silence.
I didn't get as far into the book as I wanted to, but I did get to the part where you talked about sort of the romanticism of the previously more bucolic nature of Anacostia. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how people's patterns or talk changed when they were talking about that sort of more agrarian ideal.
Yeah, so the question, repeating it for the virtual folks, is about when folks talk about Anacostia as being bucolic and being rural. And so this is something I got a lot from my older interviewees, and Troy, I don't know if you've seen this with some of your older residents, right? Which was that, there was, until very late, Anacostia did not have running water everywhere. And so many of my informants who are in their 70s and 80s remember times when they had a water pump, and they remember times when they had outhouses here, and not far, like not too far from where we are right now, Martin Luther King, which used to be Nichols, and so they would talk about, this used to be rural. We used to have chickens in our yard, and it's a way, I read it as a way of reinterpreting the beauty onto a place that many other people from DC and outside DC think of as like, this is the place that's bad, it's dirty, it's the worst part of DC. Pick through Washington Post and you see things like, Ward 8, the district's basement, and things like that are in circulation. And so, so one of the things I was lifting up with the ways that people talk about that, and instead by just saying, no, we're not even going to go there. This is a place where we had farms. This is a place where we had livestock, and we had trees everywhere. When it comes to actual language features of that, you do get a little bit of. That's going to be one of the areas where you're going to get more of that African American language features. And so I studied it strictly in terms of grammar, but there's a bunch of other things as well in terms of sound, in terms of intonation. Haven't pulled those out, but I'm sure I would find those even more so. But yeah, that part of these discourses about Southeast counter the narrative of this being a tough place or bad place or the basement, both in what they're talking about and then in claiming it through Black language itself.
And two things can be true at the same time.
Absolutely.
Again, I've said it from the very beginning. East of the river, we have a number of challenges, especially around poverty and all that stems from that. But as you mentioned, and what you have discovered and what you have also laid out in your book, is that there is a beauty here. Just the fact that I can go up on Green Street or Galen or W or a number of these, Douglas, that have these incredible vistas of Washington, D.C. in a way that is not only just breathtaking, but which makes sense. There's no other view like this ever. And people clearly, people are oblivious to it because they are afraid, right? Some people are afraid. But folks who live here, they know it. They know where to go for the 4th of July, and see the fireworks in downtown. They very much have a warm feeling about the community that they live, despite the challenges, right? Despite the problems that persist. And so you're right. And I mentioned also earlier that, these were the rolling hills of Washington, D.C. The houses were kind of big lots, there were small little communities, Berry Farm being one of them. But they were mostly rolling hills until they put that freeway through here, 295, and then Suitland Parkway they carved out, and then they subdivided a lot of the land. But yeah, rolling hills, farms, those who are older, you're right, they have a recollection of a time that it was just very different
Yeah,
from what it is now. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think, and you brought up Berry Farms, and that I thought was one of the physical features of this neighborhood that struck me. As a visitor, as someone who, by the time I was really doing this work, I had lived in DC for 5, 6, 7 years. But mostly lived in Northwest. I lived in Columbia Heights, and of course I was going to Georgetown. And like Berry Farms is now I think all the buildings are down, but
All of them except for like a row that they're preserving for historic purposes.
Yeah. But I was so struck by the fact that like you could simultaneously see in Berry Farms abject poverty and a certain amount that you could see desperation and need. And you could also see this like tree-lined green lawns, like you could see community, you could see Black community happening. And I thought like, it's like if I had to pick a visual to say like, yeah, not turning the back on the problems, not turning the back on the need, but also going, yeah, but also like, look at this 100-year-old tree that's staying here that the kids are playing underneath, and it's like, yeah, like that's Board 8. It's the beauty and the real story.
The interesting thing about Berry Farms, as you say, is that that's a local thing. They put an S on it.
They put an S on it.
Right.
There's a footnote about that in the book.
Yeah.
Actually.
That's what we do here. We say Berry Farms, but technically the subdivision was Berry Farm. And it was not just a public housing project. It was a very large swath of the land that would be, I guess, south of what was Uniontown at the time. Now, as we know it to be Anacostia, which is where we're at currently. And so there are homes today that still have on their deeds Berry Farm, the subdivision. And so we often get caught up in the public housing project, which was, all rentals. But there are actually homes that were built on many of these, lots of land. And people often forget about that. They only think about the housing project.
Right.
And so, but Berry Farms.
Berry
Yes.
Farms, we're welcome.
Yes. And it doesn't have anything to do with Marion Barry, which is what a lot of people thought.
We've got an online question.
Sure. And then we'll grab one from the floor.
Cool. So one question we have is, what was the finding that was most surprising to you from your book? Or is there a particular story that really stood out to you during your interviews?
The finding that was most, the thing I started down the path of talking about the fact that I came into this project looking at something completely different. And I thought, okay, this is a neighborhood that's being gentrified by Black people. Because the first wave of folks to come into the east of the river neighborhoods were middle and upper class Blacks. And I was like, okay, this is gonna be a great place to look at Black speech and like Black class and what it means to be a middle class Black person. And so I suppose the research itself, the thing that made the book, is the thing that was the most surprising, was that I realized, like class is not the thing, place is the thing. It's talking about where people are from, it's laying claim to this area of DC and laying claim to DC. That's what matters, and like that's what I need to look at. And so, when I dug in to write the book, went back on all of these hours of interviews and said, what I want to pull out are these sorts of conversations. How are people talking about it being rural and beautiful? How are people talking about, who's us and who's them? That was a really interesting. So one of my interviewees, Gus, said really explicitly, said, it's going to become bad for us, talking about the change in the city. And then he goes on, he goes, us, meaning Black folk, And so those sorts of moves were what was most interesting. I think that pulled out was this question of what it means to be a Black Washingtonian, and the extent to which Ward 8 really gets to stand in for Black Washington and continues to stand in, and I think may eventually be one of the last really Black parts of Washington, or at least for the longest.
Yeah, Ward 7, Ward 8 for sure. My only add to that would be throughout history, we see that Black people have, because of segregation and because of redlining,
Right.
Those of us who, had some upward mobility could not leave. We had to stay basically relegated to a certain part of town. And so I think there is some blood memory from that, right? That people tend to say, well, when I grew up, I was next, we were living next door to a whole lot of different people, right? People who may have been poor and struggling, next door to people who were doctors and lawyers. But that's not unusual in a place like Washington, D.C., really until relatively recently, a generation or two ago. And Anacostia, which you mentioned, that there is gentrification, or what we would normally call gentrification without the racial component per se. You have doctors and lawyers and publicists and people like that, living in a community, in a ward, in a section of town where there's also struggles around poverty, right?
Yep.
I keep mentioning that because we have to do something about poverty.
Right.
So that everyone has an opportunity like myself to not only survive, but thrive. And that's the thing that we often, so many Black boys in particular have lost their lives because of poverty. And so I always, whatever conversation I have, I always bring that up because we're losing the gift. You say that our numbers are, we said that numbers are dwindling. It's because we're also losing them to the streets, which I say is a result of poverty in many cases in terms of all of the challenges that come from it. So yes, we do have a certain level of, I guess, nostalgic, but just simple love of the community because it really was the only community we could live in.
Yeah.
And there is blood memory for those who were left behind or those who, who are second generation who moved back. There are some of those who feel that too.
Yeah, I think, I'm thinking of the redlining, like this is one thing that I don't want to in any way minimize, right? Are the ways in which racist economic processes, David was just tweeting about this a little bit ago, just that, I needed to book a hotel. I'm in Navy Yard. Why? Because the same racist economic systems have meant that a Hampton Inn is on the other side of the river. So
It is, but can I tell you something?
yeah,
It's now Ward 8
hey,
because of redistricting. So I know.
I dig this. Okay, so I'm in Ward 8.
Isn't it actually in Ward 8? So welcome to Ward 8. No, it is so interesting because we've had these conversations about what that means to bring in that part of the city into the ward that has been, as you mentioned from previous news clippings, called the basement of the city, right? Now you have one of the wealthiest.
Pretty nice basement. They finished the basement.
You have one of the wealthiest communities that is now tied to one of the poorest.
Yeah.
And the difference is just that river right there that runs through it. But yes, it is now Ward 8, and we, especially the work that I do as chair, as a Ward 8 leader, is that we're trying to bridge those divides on both sides. And let me just further add that just because we now have a Whole Foods in Ward 8, by the way, because we annexed that Whole Foods. And Harris Teeter and a Hampton Inn and other hotels and restaurants and oh my God, just wonderful stuff there. Oh, the park, Nats Park. That doesn't change the economic conditions of those of us who are still far away from a grocery store, of those of us who still struggle with transportation, for those of us who still have, challenges that are connected to poverty. That doesn't change. These boundaries are invisible. They mean absolutely nothing to the mom who still has to get her kids to school. And because she feels like the schools in a certain neighborhood are not up to par, she travels with those kids, far distances in order to get them to what she considers to be a good school.
Right.
That doesn't change at all the fact that we've incorporated what is one of the wealthiest parts of town.
Yeah.
So there's that.
I have more work to do. This is fun. So another question from the floor.
So I am super, super excited about this work. I too am studying DC, so of course Jesse.
This is the to-be Dr. Minnie and I.
Yeah. And so my take is a little different. I'm looking at kind of how the riots opened up and led to gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So
Can I ask which riots are you
Thank
talking about?
the 68.
Okay, because
So- There were several.
Thank you for doing that work, Megan, too. 'Cause-
Specifically looking at how older women are talking about the riots and how that now has affected DC. But I want to ask a different question. So I'm going to ask each of you a different question. So your question is going to be, what do you think it means to be from DC? Like, what is either the most iconic thing, and I don't even like the monuments. Like, what does it mean for a person to say, I'm from DC? Because there's a lot of pride in that. Like, it's one of the ladies I talked to, she's like, her mom moved to DC when she was 13. I was like, oh, so your mom's like from DC? She's like, she is not from DC. Let me be fair. So there's a certain level of what it means to be a Washingtonian. And then for you, Jesse, I think we kind of just talked about it in the last thing, but what's that one thing that you feel like there's a lingering issue? Like, hey, maybe not the next book or the next, but what's the next article? What's the next thing that you want to explore? Because there's so much and it's so rich. And I haven't read the book yet, but I have reasons that I haven't read it yet. But now
You're writing a dissertation. Stop reading.
Yeah. But I'm super excited because much of your work inspired my work. And so what's that lingering thing or that next thing that you want to tackle when we think about what does it mean to be either east of the river or just from DC? Because I think there's just a vast, like there's just so much to talk about and to discuss.
All right, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Yeah, I like this mic better. No, that's a great question, and you're right. So the question I should read, well, I think people heard it, right? About what does it mean to be from DC? For me, it is not at all about the monumental core of DC, right? The Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln, the Washington, the museums, the mall, right, as we all call it. It doesn't have anything to do with that for me. When I think about what it means to be from DC, I just think about my lineage. I think about my history. I think about the fact that my grandmother's family are from the backwoods of Page County, Virginia. Luray, as they call it. They don't say Luray, they say Luray down there. And what it took for them to say that they deserved better than what they were getting, and they thought that even though it wasn't great here when they moved here, because there was segregation, there was still meager jobs they could get, it was better than where they were from. And so I always think about my lineage of being here in Washington, D.C., and to my family that made the struggle. Lived in Tinleytown when it was two words, not one. Like we see Tinleytown as one word. It used to be Tinley Town. And then their migration to Georgetown. And then Eckington, as I mentioned earlier, and then we dispersed out into the counties after that, most of us did. But I just think about it being my hometown. I think about the people, the schools that I went to here. I went from grade school to grad school right here in Washington, D.C. And so for me, Yeah, thanks. Yeah, for me, like I epitomize, you know, the native Washingtonian. Now, luckily, I've traveled. Otherwise, it would be kind of pathetic, right? Kind of sad. I haven't been anywhere. No, but for me, though, it really is about the lineage to my family, and to all of the incredible history here. For not just American history, which I very much love and love to study, but DC history and Black history. For me, is one line that runs through all of it. And I love that, you know. And so it's not about the monuments for me or the mall. It's always been about the people who I grew up with on 2nd Street in Northeast, you know, Mr. Mills and all those folks who looked after me, even though, you know, when I was doing bad things, you know, they told my mama, they told my grandmother, you know, that boy, you know, it's all, I remember that when I think of home. That's what I think of as home.
Yeah, I think that's.
Put this one back.
Yeah, so I want to answer go back. It's a nice mic. But yeah, like I think as you were saying that, I was reflecting on talking to one of my college best friends a couple weeks ago, and she was like, you know, she's like, you talk about being Black a lot more than you did when we were undergrads in college, and now I'm like, you know, that may be because I lived for 7 years in DC. And where, you know, it's really hard to be a Black person and not develop an identity as a Black person when you're living in this city, when you're interacting with people. So, Minnie, that sort of goes to your question. One thing I think I underdid in both versions of this book, so I sometimes, not joke, this is full on truth. This book is a fan fiction of the dissertation I wrote in 2015. It has almost nothing to do with it. It is just loosely inspired by a different tract of research that I did. You know, and it was discovering that bigger question about place identity. But at the time, I was talking about it as being intersectional, and I didn't really I was just starting to understand that buzzword. And since then, I've had a lot of time to really think about what intersectionality is, what critical race theory is, what ways these things intersect and create different kinds of experiences. So I was bringing up the redlining issue, and I was reminded of, I lived in a woman's house in Georgetown for my first 2 years. I rented 300 square feet in her basement, and it was a little teeny bathroom that was it was like an airplane bathroom on steroids. Basically, it had a shower. You could touch both walls. You could barely turn around in it. The person who rented it after me was a male, and I have no idea how he used that toilet because there was not room. But that small. And I was talking to my landlady who owned the house, and she said, "Yeah, well, that's the bathroom at the bottom of the stairs. The kitchen was at the back of the house. That was where the Black maid had her bathroom. And that was there to keep her separate from the rest of the house." So then, of course, I slapped a sign on it that said colored only, and it's my bathroom. But you know, that's the history that's baked into DC. So I think the thing that is missing from this work, the thing I would like to do next, is really think about individual identities and the ways that those intersect with these different questions, right? So being a Black woman in DC is different than being a Black man in DC. And there's some tiny patterns of this in the book, in thinking about, like, for instance, who gets to criticize Ward 8, and what identities allow for criticism to happen. And so one thing that I found was, for example, my older interviewees, and especially my older working class interviewees, my interviewees who've been bus drivers and truck drivers, and they would just pop off about what was going wrong in the neighborhood and about the city. And my 30-something professionally employed interviewees were a little more measured And so the interesting thing is that the strategy that they used was often more linguistic, and so it's these very subtle shifts. And like, well, I'm gonna sound a little black here, so it's very clear that I'm still like saying that this is negative, but I'm not gonna come out the way that 75-year-old woman does in the same way. And so that is definitely underdone. And I think, I mean, really, it's not even just this project. This is something for all of us in the linguistics community, and really, period. It's a couple of political scientists, we've got an urban planner over here, but like thinking about these individual identities and how they impact our experiences is important. It's the next frontier for us to look at. Yes, Sophia.
Since you called me out.
Yep. Here comes the urban planner.
You want me to?
Yeah, make it easier.
Yes, as the aforementioned urban planner in the house, I was really struck by your comment about being squeezed in the housing market. In planning, we actually call that the missing middle. Erin reacted to that. She's like, yeah, that's what you went through. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what I went through. I made too much money to qualify for any of the support programs, but not enough money to really get into any of the things I wanted to get into. And ultimately, I got a little bit of a family gift and was able to buy a condo a couple of years ago. So what I was thinking about and wondering about, and to make this more linguistically relevant, I was wondering what kinds of conversations you and your friends and family have. Like, what's the language that you use when you're talking about the housing market and the fact that it's so hard to get into the housing market and so hard to move through the housing market, especially if you are younger and burdened by student loans. Literally recently I went to a presentation. It was the very first time I've heard anyone say, oh, maybe millennials aren't buying houses because they have student loan debt. I'm so glad somebody finally said that, because I've been to scads of presentations on housing, and these usually older white men are like, oh gee, we don't know why millennials aren't buying houses. I was like, have you talked to your children about their student loans? Anyway, so I was just curious about the conversations and the language that you and your friends use around housing and the changing market.
I appreciate the question. So we call it what it is. It's tough. It's tough to get in. And I should, again, mention, if you're in the middle, right? That tight middle. If you're low income, God bless you, you definitely have far more resources at your rate. When I purchased my home, there were resources available to me, and I'm thankful for that. But if I want to stay in the district, I'm kind of squeezed, like, I don't know, do I stay or do I go? Listen, I'm blessed to have a home and to say I'm a homeowner. I have a condo as well. And but at the same time, when we talk about this thing, this challenge, I guess we use language that I can't quite say here. but certainly it is about how tough it is and how difficult the market remains for those of us who want to stay but can't afford to stay. $600,000 for a townhome, even here in Ward 8, is just a lot of money. Most of us are single, as you know. Most people are, they're doing it solo. They may do a roommate thing, but it's because they have to. And that just wasn't the case 10, 15, even 20 years ago. People were in these, you had decent income, you could get in and find the type of housing that, will work for you. But to stay in the district, the conversation that we're having actively is how do we stay here? And so part of that is to appeal to, the policymakers about making sure they're thinking about those who are in the middle. And also, how do we build generational wealth so that we could have a gift? Many of us won't get the gift, right? God bless you and your family. Yeah, and exactly, right, which is great. But many of us don't come from backgrounds, like I wouldn't have gotten a gift from my mom, right, or from my grandmother. They didn't have it to give. They gave love, and that was it. But if we know others, they have a different financial situation, and they're able to get a gift, and that's great. But for those of us who can't, we have to figure out how do we do it. And so saving up for a down payment becomes difficult because, again, we have student loans. I still have student loans. We have other expenses. I haven't even talked about the fact that those of us who are quote unquote professional Black people who have made it generally are supporting other family members. Right. Yep. You know, like we're giving money, you know, okay, I'll use myself, you know, I help my mom out, right? You know, with her rent so that she can save a few $100s here and there. I help her do different things so that she can continue to make her money stretch. I can't bank that because I'm giving that away. And there's cousins who need a little something every now and then. And then you have your nieces. And that's fine. That's part of being part of a family. But it does impact the bottom line. If you want to, you know, go to a higher type of housing, or what am I saying, not higher housing. If you want to go to the next level in terms of your housing here or wherever, if you don't have the dollars to bank, it becomes really, really hard to do.
Yeah, well, and I'll add to that this is one of the complications of talking about gentrification in especially east of the river, where you do have families who've passed down a house that they've had for a really long time. And so how do they get to be the generation that then can give the gift to the next generation? Well, you sell the house. And so, I had a conversation with another ANC commissioner as part of the book. And one of the things that she said was, she was like, look, I can't get mad at these people for going, look, I can cash out on this house and have $500,000, and that money sets up my family for generations to come. And yes, that means that a white family moves in from Northwest and changes the character of the neighborhood, but that's also putting a Black family on a wheel that they've been excluded from historically. And so that's part of the cruel and cool complexity of this situation that I think is really fascinating.
And I think because I grew up all over the district, I love all people, right? I should be very clear. And I love the fact that in Anacostia, we you know, I'm looking at a picture on the wall here of a particular block in Anacostia, and there are a number of non-Black families who live there. And I think that's great. They're part of the community. Many of them have, you know, stepped up. They wanted to know who the folks were, who the commissioners were, you know, at the time when I was commissioner. That's great. Everyone working together, you know, you bring new ideas, you bring new thoughts to your challenges, and we're all the better for it. I think the challenge comes when when you have new people. By the way, they can be anybody. You know, it's not a racial thing. It could be me. When I first moved over here, we were trying to rebrand East of the River. You know, I hooked up with some people who were like, we want to call it River East. And I was like, yeah, I like that. It's
On
cool.
the vocal fries last week, I was like, you can hear the Whole Foods in River East.
Or as they call it where you're staying over in Navy Yard, they call the Whole Foods over there South Capitol Hill.
Oh yeah.
Now, I've never heard of that until I went to that Whole Foods. Again, that's a developer of marketing, we get that.
Right.
But yeah, I think, you know, when we've been thinking, again, I was an outsider, I lived all over, finally moved to Anacostia and got hooked up with some folks, and we were all like, yeah, let's create this organization and we're gonna name it River East, and that may take off and become, you know, a thing. And we quickly heard from residents who've lived here for a very long time, through thick and thin, through good and bad, that we're called east of the river, and that's what we will remain. And there's no question about it. And guess what? It is still called east of the river. So it did not change at all.
Yeah, there's an article there that one of these days I'm gonna get around to writing, thinking about naming practices in DC. And I often lift up NOMA, which was Rhode Island for a really long time, Rhode Island Avenue, and then it changed while I lived here, and it became North Massachusetts NOMA, and
Yeah, I think there's, and that's near where I grew up, Eckington. So Noma is technically right across the street from Eckington. And they call that, I think, Swamppool or some, yeah. And so, but no one lived there. So it was all warehouse district. So it's very easy to change a neighborhood where no one lives.
where no one lives, right?
Yeah, but when you have, 100, 50,000 people who live in both Ward 7 and Ward 8, and you're like, hey, we like River East, don't you like it too? They're like, no, we don't. And who are you? Where did you come from? And I'm like, I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian. And they're like, no.
Never mind. Did we have another one from online?
So, Jesse, do you think that class doesn't matter because the shift from lower to middle class is mutable? In other words, Black middle class folks were at one time working class, and the middle class boundary is rather slippery.
That could be a really, that's an intriguing explanation. I would say that my argument about this particular set of interviews in this particular place is that class matters, and I think, yes, that boundary is more mutable, and I think there is more of a sense that it's often generational, and especially in DC, and I think that's another important aspect to understand about DC, is that this is a place where that ladder can start, and so you have fourth generation Washingtonians where the great grandparent generation started out doing something very working class or even lower working class, so you might classify it. And then in so doing and by being here, then each generation is able to go forward. Now, of course, not at the same speed, and like 180 years later than the white generations because of slavery and Jim Crow and all these sorts of things, but that engine is able to move here in a way that it wasn't. So I think that's part of it, where people are not going to make as strict of a class divide in the Black community. But I also think it's particular to this community in that that's not what people are about emphasizing here. What people are about emphasizing east of the river is east of the river. It's about unified Black DC, it's about claiming DC, it's about claiming Black identity. And so, like when I say I didn't find class findings, like, yeah, there are, especially when I'm looking at like sociophonetics. But that's not what matters. That's not how you get people, that's not the thing people are talking about. People are talking about what it means to be from here, like you did, Troy, and what it means to be part of this community.
And can I just add a sobering statistic when you think about what it means to be from here? The Black male life expectancy is about 17 years less than the white male in this city. And guess where the discrepancies show up? Ward 8 and Ward 3, right, which is the wealthiest ward in our city. Oh, yeah, the wealthiest ward. Also, just life expectancy in general for Black people is lower than it is in west of the park that we talked about earlier. And then so there's life expectancy, but then there's the educational wealth. Oh, I'm sorry, the economic wealth. I think it's like $22,000 maybe in DC for the average Black person, and it's like $150,000 $150 or north of that probably north of that for the average white person in the district. And again, I think sometimes when we say that, and shout out to those people who are very much against critical race theory. But when we say that, it's not because we want to make you feel bad, right? We just want to make sure you are enlightened, that you are indeed at a position of privilege, and let's work together for the beloved community to change that, right? We often look at ourselves in silos in this city. I'm over here, you over there, I'm here, I'm there. But east of the river, we're all in it together. In Ward 8, we're all in it together. And I think what we've been trying to do was to have those honest, thoughtful conversations about how do we build generational wealth? How do we all, myself and our newcomers and people who've been here, how do we all work to make it easier for the next generation in terms of their ability to build wealth?
Yeah, and I think that's the question, and that's the thing that I see people working toward, and
We're trying. And, I remember hearing someone say there was some people who were from Africa. They were from, I think, Nigeria. They said, "Well, in our language, we don't have a word for try." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. I understand." They say either do or you don't. Make a lot of sense, right?
Do or do not. There is no try.
There's no try. But I happen to like the fact that we have a word for try. Or that we actually have a word, rather, we use the word try to illustrate the process of how we get there. Because the process matters too, just as much as the process matters if we don't do it, right? Like what failed, how did we not move the needle? So if we continue to try, now we need to move the needle, let me be straight on that. But I think we need to account for the process too, because the process, some gems can come along the way.
Yeah.
I have to end there. No, I can take. I just have a 8 o'clock.
One more quick question.
I guess I wanted to ask a question. Jesse, one of your many gifts is music, and I was kind of wondering about go-go in Washington, D.C., and whether you heard how people talk about go-go in the interviews you did, and how they talk about it, and what kind of requesting forms come out of that, and the pride that comes out of that. And I don't know, because it's such a big part of identity.
I can't believe we didn't talk about go-go.
Right?
Until the very end.
Until the very end, right? Actually, I didn't talk very much about go-go. I didn't ask very much about it. I want to hand them Minnie, I almost want to pull you up here. Minnie has done a ton of work on go-go. And we have this musical form in DC that is very local to DC. It is one of these areas in which people linguistically are inhabiting and performing Blackness through Black language as part of these connections. But Troy, your experience with go-go.
Very quickly. So, when the sister here asked earlier about what it means to be from DC, it also means that we have that unique music, that unique culture. So go-go is not just music, it is a culture, right? And it's huge here. It's very much like the brass bands of New Orleans, which I love. Like when they come here and the helmets and I go check them out because I love live music. That's the other thing. Because of go-go, you can't come here to DC as a musician. Even if you're a Black artist or a white artist, you got to bring some instruments here because we're used to hearing drum and the bass and the keys and the guitar and the congos if I go there. Yeah. So we're used to hearing that, and so if you don't bring up, we're going to be polite, but we're not going to get into it because we've just grown up on this idea of live music. So you see out in the community, it's not hard to see like a little a gaggle of individuals, playing the drums and the instruments because that's culture. And I know at one point down in Chinatown, which has, as you know, rapidly gentrified, there was some struggle there among new residents who were like, okay, what is going on here? It's 10 o'clock at night, y'all still I get it, it's 6 o'clock. but at 11. And so I think, there was some struggle there. And eventually they came to, a happy medium, I suspect. Same thing with music blaring from a speaker at a Metro PCS store on Florida and I guess at Florida and 7th Street where Georgia and everything sort of comes together. Yeah. And, there were some condo owners who said, hey, well, we think they were condo owners, who said, hey, like, we're hearing this music all, now listen, if you're a condo owner, it's a homeowner, you expect to be able to enjoy your home. And that makes a lot of sense, but that clashed with what they had been doing for years in terms of blasting music out to attract people to that location for whatever they were selling. And they came to a happy medium. They decided that they would turn the music down. So it wasn't as loud, but they would still broadcast music out. And that created a new movement called Don't Mute DC.
Right.
And that's part of the go-go movement and the part of the go-go culture. So yeah, we could go on and on about that.
Well, and
But,
Don't Mute DC is about, and I guess,
It's a lot of things.
this is gonna be a perfect thing
Yeah.
to wrap up on, right? The subtitle of the book is Race, Language, and Belonging. And there's a part of belonging to DC that is belonging to the Black culture of DC. And, especially with Don't Mute DC, you see this desire for inclusion of other people, but to say what you're going to be included in is a culture that is historically Black. And you can live here and you can understand that, in which case, great, bring your money, bring your stuff, buy your condo, contribute to the economy. You'll have fun. It's gonna be a good time.
A funky good time.
But what you're coming into is a place that's a Black place, and
It's
that's
a great way to
the thing
think
that
about
has
it.
to stay.
I think that's exactly what it is. And the Don't Mute DC, while it was birthed out of this this struggle on U Street, Florida, with Metro PCS store there, it has grown or morphed into a bigger connotation. People have used it about just everything that happens to Black culture that has to do with Black culture. So it's like, don't mute me. Not just don't mute DC. I am so DC that if you mute DC, you're gonna mute me. And so it's about don't mute me in all of the sense of the word. Don't mute my vote, don't mute my statehood, don't mute my life, don't mute DC. It really is synonymous for me, right, when people say it. So I think you're right. Like this is we could probably spend another hour on that. And there's some far more intelligent people who could talk with you about the Don't Mute DC and what that movement is and where it's going.
Yeah, well, I'll end us on the note that I end the book on, because this is beautiful. This was like teed up perfectly. Thank you, Tom. Because I end up thinking about what it means to listen to the Black side of the river, and that's the last line of the book is that the call is to listen to the Black side of the river and listen to Black DC, listen to the go-go music, understand the Black culture here, and that's how DC thrives, and that's how DC stays and survives.
Don't mute DC.
Don't mute DC. Thank you, Fred, for being in conversation.
Thank you. Okay, yes, so thank you for having me, and thank you for including me in the book, although under another name.
Although now we figured out who you are, so it's
Have we
okay.
figured it out? I need to figure it out. But no, thank you all again for being a great audience as well. What I hope the takeaway is that you understand DC culture in a way that you might not have before, that you understand the importance of the Black lived experience here in the nation's capital, and really how it's impacted the entire, not just country, but the world. What happens here in Washington, from the Howards to the district government and the people who had a chance to build wealth and, of course, populate Prince George's County. But how all of that has really had a global impact, even on your work. So thank you for helping to tell that story.
Yeah, thanks.
joining. That was such an interesting conversation. As someone who's a transplant living in Prince George's County, I learned a lot today, and I hope everybody else did as well. Thank you to our live streamers for joining us. Yeah, have a good evening and get home safely. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
I learned so